Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, guten tag. I hope you guys are awake wherever you are on the planet. I am going to talk to you about tough presentation situations. And the goal for this presentation is to cover all the things, or at least some of the things, that most books on public speaking never quite get to. Most of the things that you read, or even new books that come out about public speaking, they tend to focus on all the basic things. And the basics, once you learn them, are pretty easy. It's when all these strange, crazy, bizarre, chaotic, horrible, nightmare situations happen that people often ask me for advice. So this talk is a compilation of those little nuggets of advice about different situations. But before I do that and talk and run you through about, we'll probably have time to get to maybe 10 or 12 situations. Before I hit those, I just want to give you a little bit of perspective. I am not a full-time professional public speaking coach, although I do coaching and teach workshops now and then. Primarily, I'm a writer. So the book, Confessions of a Public Speaker, that some of the topics I'm going to talk with today came from, was written just because I had learned so many things in trying to be a successful author and having to give dozens of different kinds of lectures and workshops in different places. So I'm primarily a writer. I've written 5 books. If you're curious about the other books I've written, you can just go to scottberkun.com/books, and there's free chapters there if you're curious. If you are impressionable, there's blurbs from famous people who I paid a lot of money to give me fake blurbs. No, I'm just kidding. They're actually real blurbs. But if you want to learn more about my background and how I came to do so many talks, that's where you should go. Now, I should say that you guys are here because you wanted to get a free presentation. So I know that you like free things. There's a couple of free things I want to make sure I tell you about before I dig in. So the first is a checklist. I'm a fan of checklists, especially for things like space shuttle launches or trying to keep nuclear power plants running or giving presentations. So I put together this checklist that is free. It's designed to be easily printable. It's actually got checkboxes on it, and it covers most of the basics that people get wrong. So if you go to bit.ly/speaker checklist, you can actually go and download that right now. It may not be, if you're on a lousy connection, I wouldn't do that because it's going to chew up your bandwidth. You may not be able to hear me for a little while, but you should grab that sometime today. The second free thing I want to tell you about is there's a free chapter of the book, Confessions of a Public Speaker, and it's a chapter that focuses entirely and completely on public speaking fear, how it works, what's going on in your brain, the amygdala, the reptilian part of your brain, and how it's in control of your lives, whether you know it or not. And that's really the best place to go for any questions or issues regarding pure fear and how to manage it, how to prevent it, how to minimize it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today because I put that into the basics category. And the last thing, if you like what you hear today and you want more insights from the book, I gave a talk at Google about 2 years ago when the book came out, and you can watch the whole talk for free, and it covers the 5 or 6 major takeaways from the book. So you can just go over there and watch that whenever you like. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the basic advice, but I do need to point out one or two key things from this list. The first key thing, and no one wants to hear this, people get kind of disappointed when I tell them this, but just about every tough presentation situation is either preventable or the damage of it can be reduced simply by preparing better. I have dealt with just about every situation that is in this talk or one people have asked me about. I've had laptops break. I've had projectors go out. I've had fire alarms go off. I've had the power go out. I've had just about everything happen. And if I prepare in the right way, I can still do something valuable for an audience. So I have to emphasize practicing is so important. If you don't know your own material, it's way harder to deal with all these external challenges because you're still struggling to deal with your own message. And I say here practice but don't rehearse. And by that I mean your objective in practicing is for you to get comfortable with your own material. It's not to be perfect. It's not to say everything on each slide the right way or the perfect way. Nobody but you knows what it was you meant to say. So practicing is really about you. and you becoming comfortable enough with your material so you know what the next slide is, you know what your major points are. I say major points, and by that I mean, so the second bullet on this list, is most talks that you go to are pretty bad. The bar for public speaking is really low. And despite how long it's been a primary mechanism for how we communicate for each other, I mean, if you think about it, every event or conference you go to is comprised of a series of speakers. You think by now we've gotten much better at the general basic craft of speaking. But in general, I think the bar is really low. And a fundamental failure is a speaker who simply doesn't even answer the 5 most common questions that their audience has on the topic that they chose to attend. 5 basic questions, whatever the 5 most common questions are. That's a really low bar. And if you structure a talk around those 5 things, or not even those 5 things, any 5 things, any 5 points you want to make, any 5 messages you want to get across, 5 stories you want to tell, that sets you up for dealing with crisis. Because no matter what goes on, you can remember those 5 topics, those 5 stories, and just tell them informally, and you'll probably do okay. But most people fall into the trap of not practicing enough. They don't construct their talk around 5 or 6 key points, and they depend incredibly heavily on their slides, and they become a prop to the slides. So if there's a problem with the projector or a problem with the slides, everything falls apart because the show is really a magic act with the slides and the starring role. So I'm going to move on now. I don't want to spend too much time on the basics, as I mentioned. This is a little brief thing just about crafting titles. Part of what helps people set themselves up to pick 5 points or 5 questions is choosing a thoughtful title. So many titles that people have are far too generic, and it sets them up when they're developing material not to come up with things that can be easily constructed into 5 units or 6 units. So I just have some randomly made up examples here. If I were given the top set of titles, I'd convert them into something like the bottom set. I try to convert it into something actionable, something that gave me an easier way to divide up all of my knowledge, and made it easier again for me to make the talk fault tolerant so it can fall down back into just 5 simple stories. Chapter 15 of Confessions of a Public Speaker is all about disasters. So there's a list of about 20 of them in the book. And I'm going to cover as many of these as I can. I expect to get to about 10 or 12 of them. And then while time for Q&A, so if you have situations that I didn't cover that you want to do, you're free to go and ask them. So situation number 1. Are you guys ready? I'm just going to check here in the chat room. If you guys could just say, yes, Scott, we are excited and ready to go in the chat room. I'm going to wait to see what my lag is here so I know for future reference. Okay, you guys are actually awake and you're not robots, although Paula is apparently asleep. Cool. Okay, I'm going to get going. So number 1, you are late for your own talk. Someone actually sent me an email asking about this situation this morning in preparation for this talk. I thought it was funny that they sent me a question which was late because I asked for the questions on my blog a few days ago. They sent me a late question about being late. So the short answer is this is your fault. If you're late, that means you suck. You can blame the traffic. You can blame you got lost, but that's all on you. That's your responsibility. When you speak to an audience, you have 50 people, 100 people. Okay, maybe it's just 10 people. Even 10 people, they're volunteering their time to come listen to you. It's your obligation to get there as early as necessary to make sure you never have to deal with the situation. If you do happen to be late, something happens, you end up at the emergency room or a piano lands on your head or something and you're going to be late, the first thing to do is make sure the organizer knows. They may be able to shift you later in the schedule. They may be able to have an extra break. Help the organizer help you by immediately telling them, hey, I'm sorry, I know I'm going to be 20 minutes late, or I know I'm going to be 5 minutes late. Can you cover for me? Once you do arrive, once you make it there, you are probably so panicked that you need to take 30 seconds or a minute, even though you're late, just to collect yourself. There's nothing worse than being late other than being late and showing up and then being a complete mess, scrambling and rushing your way through a talk. That just makes it even worse. Now, instead of them having to wait for you for 10 minutes, we're getting a crappy version of a presentation. So take a minute once you've arrived, go get a drink of water, everything's going to be okay, calm yourself down, and then start. You should apologize, but apologize once. There's nothing worse than a speaker who uses up every fourth minute or fifth minute by apologizing again and apologizing again. It's just annoying. It doesn't help anyone. And the last thing is plan to do a shorter version. Drop your last story. Drop 2 stories if you have to. If you build, as I mentioned before, if you build your deck in the right way, the best, most important stuff is early. The last few stories are probably not the strongest ones, so just drop them. Don't rush through your slides at 90 miles an hour. Just drop it. And then get to Q&A and let the audience drive what happens next. Number 2, this is becoming increasingly common, is what to do if you are presenting to a group of people who are completely addicted to their phones or laptops or iPads or PlayStations or whatever equipment they have brought with them. They are completely focused on it. The simple version of this is everyone's staring at their laptop. Now, there's an assumption here that if people are staring at their laptop, that they're not paying attention to you, and that's not necessarily true. It could be that they're taking notes. It could be that there are people who are on Twitter. It could be that they're in a chat room that was set up by the organizers. So you shouldn't necessarily take it as a sign of rejection that people are using their computers. I think if it does bother you, there will be some people in the room who either, they forgot their phone, their battery's dead, for whatever reason, they are giving you their eye contact. Focus on those people. Give them more of your energy. Maybe take a pause in your talk to let them ask a question. As soon as and this is, being interactive is a little bit more challenging. I can talk more about that later in Q&A. But being interactive, you get people out of their sedentary, lethargic consumption mode, and now they are engaged and have a possibility to interact with you as a speaker, and that can get more people to put their laptops down or at least give you more eye contact. It's also good if you notice in the minute before you start talking that you're in a crowd of people, just the culture where you are, that everyone's on their phones and on their laptops, then maybe you should ask for a volunteer or ask the organizer, the host, to volunteer to look at the back channel for you, and halfway through the talk to bring up a question out of the back channel and put it into the front channel for you. That's a good way to help re-engage people. It's a good way to help make sure that anything that's going on that maybe is important that you're not hearing, that you hear. Just to take a question from chat, any tips for, Colleen has a good question, any tips for presenting to youths? Well, I think that the formality of lectures is a put-off to even people of my generation. I'm 41 years old. The younger and younger people are, the less formally inclined they are. They expect you to tell stories instead. They have a higher bar for engagement. And one easy way to do that is simply not to have slides. If you get up there and speak directly to people and what you say is concise and you offer questions early on, then you're going to get people's engagement much sooner. So if ever I speak to students, which sometimes I do, and I mean high school students, or even junior high students, I almost never have slides. Or if I do, it's very small. And I try to focus on telling stories and getting them engaged and asking them questions. Okay, situation number 3. My toughest moment is when I realize my talk is not tailored for the audience. Well, this is another one that falls back onto you, the burden for you as a speaker. This is half your fault. Half of this is your fault, and half of this is your host's fault. Half it's your fault because nothing prevents you before you agree to do a talk to ask the organizer who's going to be there. Are these experienced people? Are they novices? Are they young? Are they old? Are they aliens? Are they from Mars? Are they from Venus? Who are these people? How much experience do they have? Why are they coming? What are you going to tell them about the talk? Now, in your description, usually when you speak, you're asked to give a description and a title. That should say something about who you expect is coming. Novices only, experts only, intermediate. You should be doing everything you can to help prevent this from happening. Now, assuming you show up and you expect experts, and you show up and you realize everyone's a novice, or you're not sure, you have the suspicion that everyone's a novice, early on in your talk, after your introduction, after you've been there for, you started talking, you're getting a vibe that they're not getting what you're talking about, you can quickly poll the audience. Just ask a couple of clarifying questions. You can usually do it with just 3 or 4 questions. How many of you have never written a blog post? How many of you have done it more than once? How many of you do it once a week? How many of you do it? You can come up with a way to help divide up and get demographic data. It's not uncommon for me to do this early on in the talk if I realize I'm concerned I may have the wrong level. And once I know what the level is, I can spend less time on certain parts of my talk and more time on other parts of the talk. But that clarifying thing is something you as a speaker are completely empowered to do. Now, the last thing here, if ever I do that and I calibrate and it still feels wrong, I'll probably still try to shorten the talk. A talk or presentation, that's kind of a machine. I built it with one set of assumptions in mind. If those assumptions are wrong, I'm better off getting the Q&A sooner, so I can spend more time hearing questions and actually answering directly the things people think. The things people have come to have. The things people think for themselves are the reasons why they came. In some cultures, getting people to ask questions is a challenge on its own, and that's something I can talk more about later if you want. But even so, if I'm doing a talk that I think is wrong, that I think isn't a good match, and I poll and it's still not a good match, I'm still better off ending the talk shorter than making an audience sit through an entire hour presentation that I believe while I am doing it is wrong. I'd be still better off going to Q&A and not getting a single question. At least I'd get out of people's way and let them move on to the next speaker or the next thing in their lives and not waste their time. Okay, enough on that one. So Ted Young, just to clarify that, if I get to Q&A and there are no questions, that means I'm done. Because if people who've been sitting there for 20 minutes or whatever can't think of a single question to ask me in an audience of people who are comfortable enough to ask questions, then that means I need to get off the stage. They're not interested. I didn't do a good job convincing them that I'm credible on the subject, or I didn't pick a topic that was interesting enough for them to want to spend more time talking to me. So I'll leave. In fact, sometimes I have done presentations. I actually love doing it this way. That's purely Q&A. I show up, I talk for 5 minutes, I give people a sense for my opinion on whatever the topic is and set the stage, and then I do Q&A for the entire hour. Or, and I tell them this, or until there's no more questions and people are bored, and then we go home. There's no reason to torture people. Okay, here's another one, another situation. I wait too long to put together the presentation, and I work on the presentation during other sessions. This is another one where it's purely your fault. Whenever I see people working frantically on their presentation in someone else's presentation, I feel really bad. I feel like they have low respect for their audience if they think they can just wing it and just get by. And I mentioned earlier on that the bar for presentations are so low. I think that's part of why. People want to do as little work as possible, maybe in part because they're scared, but for whatever reason. So they wing it, and they do it last minute, and then they get away with it because no one's going to heckle you, really. No one's going to throw tomatoes at you. So they get away with it, and then they do it again. I have a chapter in the book called Do Not Eat the Microphone that talks about people who wing it and my disrespect for their disrespect, and a very simple process for coming up, a very simple process for not winging it, and how to develop material for a talk in a very simple way. Okay, moving on. One general note about speaking that's important to know, it's important to think about, is that at its core, especially if you're speaking to a large group, there's something theatrical about public speaking. You're in an environment like a theater. There's a stage or a lectern and podium. There's rows and rows of people who are all facing you. There's certain constructions about public speaking that are like theater performances. And so I have spent time studying theater and studying acting and thinking about how that affects the way people perceive you as a public speaker. I don't get too hung up on body language and those sorts of. There are some people get really obsessive about those things. That's not what I mean. I just mean there's a basic construction here that it's worth paying attention to. That you are effectively the center of attention, and you are the person who is driving the show. But the trap that many people fall into is they realize this, and they feel like the spotlight is on them, and they have to be perfect. So here's the situation someone posted and asked me. I obsess about not making a mistake, which magnifies in my head until I turn into a rambling, panicky pile of goo. So unlike the theater, no one knows what you're going to say. When you go see a play, you go see Hamlet, everybody knows every line, or a lot of people know every line. There's a very specific way it's supposed to be said. Iambic pentameter, there's this rigorous system. You are not doing Shakespeare. You're not even acting. You're basically doing a kind of improv. You are doing a thing that's your own invention. No one's telling you what you have to say or not. So that means that the pressure on you is different. It's not about perfection. It's really about just being compelling. It's really about just telling a good story or answering questions. There's an effectiveness element that's unlike the theater. Your bar is much, much lower. So I mentioned before about practice versus rehearsal. You're practicing to be comfortable. So you're familiar with your material. So you know how one story follows the next one and how the next one follows that and how you're going to end it. So you're comfortable. So you get up there and you're relaxed. You're not worried about your next slide. You're not worried about whether story number 4 should go before number 3 or whatever. That's really the goal of the practice. The other element around fear is, and I mentioned before, you should read that free chapter about fear. Everything that I learned in studying, all that stuff, is in that chapter. Fundamentally, you can't shut your brain off. The amygdala is the reptilian part of your brain. It decides for you what to be afraid of or not. You don't have control over it. Just like you don't control your heart rate, you don't control your breathing. It's this very old, ancient, and honestly, a pretty crotchety part of your brain. So you're stuck with it, but you can do things that turn the notch down and how sensitive it is. And exercise is the best documented way to do that. That if you go run for an hour the morning of a talk, your body is going to be less amped up, your amygdala is going to be less easy to trigger, and you'll be calmer, and you'll do a much better job. So exercise, I think, is really important. All right. Next up, yes. So speaking of, someone asked me about the Michael Bay situation. Sorry, I'm just taking a quick look at the chat room. Okay, someone asked about the Michael Bay situation, which is where basically, I don't know how many of you saw this, but he got up on stage at CES, and it was a very big event for Samsung, and after 20 seconds, apparently the teleprompter broke or froze, and he freaked out and left the stage. And I think it's kind of sad to see this happen to anybody. Now, people ask me, well, what happens when you just freeze? You totally, like your brain, you just have a moment where you freeze. And my answer to that is, well, when I freeze, I freeze. And I collect myself, and then I apologize to the audience, sorry about that, and then I keep going. Fundamentally, for anything that goes wrong, including mistakes that you make yourself, including the projector blowing up, including a fire starting in the back row, whatever goes wrong, people are looking to you to decide how to respond to it. If you're calm, they're like, oh, this isn't a big deal. He's calm. If you're panicked, they'll think, oh, this is bad. He's panicking. It's a very primitive social response. And so if I'm calm, or I need a minute, 30 seconds to collect my thoughts and move on to the next thing, the audience after that go, well, that was weird. Okay, what's he talking about now? And no big deal. So Michael Bay's mistake, it wasn't that he froze. It was his own response to freezing and being confused. He also was depending heavily on the teleprompter. And I mentioned before, he basically let the teleprompter be the master, and he became a slave to it. So once it broke, he was like, well, the whole show's over. I got to run. So you'd never, even if you're using a teleprompter or, slides in a way are kind of like a teleprompter because it's telling you the next thing to do. If you structure your thing around 5 points or 5 messages, no matter what happens, you just move on to the next one. So that's what I'll do if I'm presenting and I have one of these moments where I just freeze and I completely lose my train of thought. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'll just pause. I'll try to collect myself, and if I can't, I'll go, you know what? Sorry, I lost my train of thought, and I'll move on to the next point. Move on. No one wants to see you spend 5 minutes trying to remember what you were trying to say. They don't know what it was anyway. So I just move on, and then maybe later on I'll remember what it was, and if I really think it's worth it, I can jump backwards. So this, I have to give a lecture during dinner. Now, this is one of these weird things. It's sort of like an antiquated notion, like the dinner speaker. And every now and then I get hired to do one of these things. And it's always strange. And I know as someone if you're in the audience at these things, they're weird. So I don't really know. It's sort of like a compromise. It means that people's dinner is being interrupted, and it means the speaker is going to have to fight over the sound of forks and knives. It's just a weird thing. So if you can avoid this, I think you should. The only people who could probably handle this well are stand-up comedians. If ever you think you have a tough presenting situation, stand-up comedians have it way worse. And so they are probably the best qualified to handle situations like this. Anyway, I've done them. When I do them, I make it shorter. I make it simpler. I always make sure to ask about the PA system in the room because it is an issue. When you have 50 people or 100 people, even if they're eating quietly and carefully, they're making noise. And it's a distraction to the audience, and it's a distraction for speakers. So I want to make sure that I'm well amplified. Also, you want to make sure you're speaking at the end and not during dinner, which has happened to me once. I thought they meant I was going to be like the dinner speaker in quotes, and I'd be at the end. But no, I was speaking while they ate. The style has to be less formal because the fact that people are eating makes it less formal. People are putting stuff in their bodies, which is a biological process. And if you're up there doing a really hardcore, serious talk, I think it's just it's just a mismatch of forms. So if you can avoid this, I think you should. It's really not all that much fun. Okay, I've been asked this a few times recently. So Bono or whoever your favorite celebrity is, maybe Macklemore, whoever, someone really popular and fun, just finished their talk and you are next. People dread this. People think that now the bar is so high that there's no way they could do a good job. And they get up there and they do something stupid, like they try to redo their talk on the fly. They do something really radical. And it's a mistake for a bunch of reasons to worry too much about this. First of all, we context switch all the time. On TV, on the web, on our phones, we are context shifting. We're dealing with different styles and different tones and different quality of work all the time. So there's no shame in being different. There's no reason anyone expects you to be as good or as good in the same way as the person you just finished. So don't worry about that. You worked hard to prepare a certain kind of material, and if you prepared well and you know your audience because you asked about them, you have demographics about them, and you built a good talk around that, you should stick to your plan. Go ahead, it's also sometimes if this happens to me, I will, while I'm listening to the talk, I'll think about dropping my intro and just starting off with the first story. Intros are kind of stupid anyway. Nobody cares if you went to college. Nobody cares how many years you've been doing whatever you're doing. Really, nobody cares. They can read about that on the website for the materials for the event that you're at. Whoever the host is chose you for a reason. Your background is not really that important. And narratives are how we engage people. And if you're going to switch gears, someone just spoke and they were high energy and they were really funny, and you're not that funny and you're kind of low energy, if you start by telling a story, the first interesting story you have in your deck, you're going to draw people in because you're different, because they have to listen a little bit more carefully, and because the way that you're speaking and the way you're telling the story is different. So the last thing is that you can look at this as sort of a warm-up for you. Getting an energy up and excited is a good thing. That's way better than having an audience that's tired and is burnt out and is really disappointed and angry and hostile, that having an audience that's up and is smiling when you get on stage is a benefit. The last thing I should say about this is that many events now are recorded on video, and then you put them on YouTube or your website or whatever, and people listen to them later. And odds are high that more people will hear or see your speech out of context. They won't know who spoke before you. They won't know who spoke after you. They'll just see the beginning of your talk. So sometimes when I'm in a really awkward situation and I feel uncomfortable, for whatever reason, I feel like I'm at the wrong event, I feel like the speaker before me said too many stories that are similar to mine, I'll be thinking, okay, is it recorded? If it is, then I need to do this presentation for all the people who will see this in the future. And I'm trying to do a great job for them, because that's maybe, probably, how most people will end up seeing my material. Let me take a quick look here at group chat. Martha asks, I attend a Q&A with an author who has a devoted following. One attendee asks, will you be my mentor? What followed was an awkward conversation that threw the rest of Q&A off. How would I have handled it? Well, I hope I'm fortunate enough to have that happen. I've had things like that happen where people just say something really sweet and sort of personal, and it doesn't fit because they're being far too personal in a setting that's very formal. As a speaker, if someone makes a statement, you thank them, and then you move on. And you don't need to directly answer any particular question. Politicians are masters at this. You can actually take courses in media training which teach you Aikido-like tactics for seeming like you're answering a question, but actually answering something very different. So for situations like that where I'm asked something awkward, I'd probably thank them and make a joke and then move on, because it's really not something appropriate to talk about in front of 100 people. Okay. Yeah, by the way, George has a great point about Lincoln, that the Gettysburg Address was actually the undercard. It was a minor speech. It was a 2-minute speech, and no one remembers the name of the guy who spoke after him, who spoke for like 3 hours and was the main speaker of the day. So you never know which presentation or which topic is going to. Well, actually, I think I just skipped ahead. Hold on one second. Let me go back. Okay, so this is a common one: the laptop, projector, microphone, podium, lighting system. Something is on fire or exploded, or a fire alarm went off. Some of this is your fault as a speaker. The more elaborately constructed your presentation is, the more videos and movies and demos and all kinds of crazy stuff you want to do, the more degrees of difficulty, the more places something can fail are. So you are raising the stakes. And I try to lower the stakes when I speak. I don't want to worry about those things. There are ways to effectively get people engaged and excited without relying on technology. So I try to bet on those. Then if the laptop explodes or the projector blows up, I still have my voice. And I still have my stories. And I still have my careful thinking about the questions the audience has and my ability to answer them. So, but practically speaking, if you do have a complicated setup, ask or demand that you get a dry run. Ask someone to meet you, a tech person to meet you at the venue early, a half hour early, an hour early, so you make sure that things work exactly how you think. Most issues that happen with laptops or projectors or whatever, it's usually because the speaker showed up late. And so in real time, they now have to debug and troubleshoot. Debugging and troubleshooting in real time is very stressful. It's also painful for an audience to sit and watch you debug in real time. You don't want to do that. You'd never see, at a theater show, you'd never see them start late with the curtains open because someone's jiggering the lighting or someone has a music thing that isn't working. You'd never see them do that. That'd be unprofessional. So it's unprofessional for you to put yourself in a situation where that's going to happen. So spend 5 minutes trying to do it, trying to fix it, and if 5 or 6 minutes go by, give up. And now revert back to a simpler version of your talk. Now, I mentioned this whole thing about having 5 points and whatever, and I'm hitting you over the head with that. There's a blog post that I wrote a while ago about how to present without slides that walks you through one method for preparing talks in this way. even if you do choose to have slides, by building your presentation in this method, it sets you up to have an easy fallback plan. So there's a picture here. That's my fallback plan. That was basically my talk. It was a bulleted list of 5 points, and you can up on stage. That's what I brought with me, and I spoke based on what I had practiced. But if I lost my place, I at least knew what the next point was, and could move on. Someone's saying in here, Michael's mentioning that he always uses his laptop, not a supplied one. That way I'm 100% sure it works. And I do the same thing. I demand that I use my laptop. Then if something blows up, I am accountable. I am responsible. In some cases, people ask for slides that they're going to put on some main computer, and that's a risky proposition. In most events, in most situations, it's really just a logistical convenience for the organizer. It doesn't improve the odds of the speaker doing a good job. So I try to resist that when I can. I'm usually willing to show up early in exchange. I promise them I will be there on time. I will be there early. I will do a test run with my laptop in exchange for me having control over the actual machine that's being used to present. So this is a common one. I only have a couple, just to let you know, I only have a couple more situations in my actual slide deck, and then we'll switch. I'll do more Q&A and more group chat stuff. So if you've been anxious, is he going to get to X? Is he going to get to Y? You'll have a minute and a second to try to convince me to answer your question. So being heckled, this is often one of the first things I get asked, and heckling is rare. This is really rare. It's very high on people's list of fears, but it's really uncommon. Unless you are a comedian, that's really the only situation where this is a common occurrence. So I've probably been heckled, I don't know, maybe a half dozen times. I have done hundreds of lectures. I mean, maybe over 1,000. I don't really keep track. I do lots and lots of lectures and talks and workshops, etc. I've probably been heckled 6 or 7 times. And then if you include people who sort of interrupt you with a question during your talk or interrupt you with a comment, they're not yelling at you, but they're interrupting. I don't know, maybe it's happened 20 times, 30 times, somewhere in there. Anyway, the advice is the same. Right off the bat, you should know no one cares about the heckler. They're not rooting for the heckler. They came to hear you. And you have power. You're the one person on stage. You're the one person with a microphone. If you really wanted to, you could get into a yelling match with the heckler, and they would lose every time because you have the PA system and the speakers behind you. They may have forgotten that for the moment, but it's pretty easy to remind them of that. So usually what I do, someone heckles me, they yell something out, they stand up and raise a question even though I didn't ask for questions. I'll just be polite. I'll say, hey, can you hold questions till the end? Comments? I'll ask yours first, but please hold it to the end. 100% of the time, maybe 95% of the time that I've done that, they comply. Over. Situation over. The trap I've seen speakers fall into is feeling obligated to oblige some random person who interrupted you. You are under no obligation to oblige them. It is your show. You are in charge. Unless, of course, it's the host of your organizer, or your boss is interrupting you. Then the politics and the dynamics are different. But generally, this person is not in charge. You're in charge. If they persist, you should ask the organizer, the host, to remove them. They are interfering with what's going on. They're not participating in the way that you structured it. So you should ask them to leave. And someone asked, someone asked, what if you have no microphone and the heckler is a VIP? Well, in the dynamics, so I mentioned the theater structure. Everyone is sitting facing the stage. There's really no VIP who's not on the stage. In the social dynamic in that situation, they are not a VIP. If they were a VIP, they'd be on the stage. End of story. And people will respect that dynamic. We are social creatures. We understand since we're 5 years old the power dynamics of being in a classroom. And that is effectively what every speaking environment is. So if a VIP is rude, I'll treat them like a rude person. I once had a professor at a university. Oh, he wasn't the professor who invited me to speak, but he sat in the front row. He asked me a question every 2 or 3 minutes, and eventually I asked him to stop, and then a minute later he left. And when he left, everybody kind of smiled. Apparently he does this a lot, where he heckles people or he interrupts people. So I treated him in the way that was appropriate given the dynamics, and I think that's what any speaker should do, and that's what the audience, the majority of the people who are in the room, that's what they're hoping and expecting that you'll do. Okay. There's a rambling question that makes no sense and takes 3 minutes to ask. This is similar to the heckler. You're being held hostage by someone who was not invited to speak. So realize the audience doesn't like these people either. They start groaning after about 30 seconds. They also groan as soon as someone says, I have a 2-part question. And the joke that you're supposed to say as a speaker, you're supposed to interrupt them at that point and say, just ask the good one. To pick one, you don't get 2 questions. Some people do, well, I have a comment and a question. And, that stuff is fine if they're brief. If they ramble on for 30 seconds, I often interrupt them. I say, look, excuse me, I understand you have a lot you want to say. Do you have a brief question? And if they don't answer right away, I go, we'll come back to you. And then I go to somebody else. And then maybe if they get their thing straight, I'll come back to them and ask them. You should also, if you feel it's a little too confrontational, when you interrupt them, say, I don't think you formed your question yet. If you come up with it later, just email me. Here's my contact info. I'll answer your question offline. And then you take the pressure off of them solving this problem in real time. This is my last tip for you, my last situation for you in my deck. If you are asked an impossible question, what should you do? Well, the answer is simple. You say you don't know. Nothing's more revealing and comforting to people when you as a speaker are just honest with them. You stop pretending like you know everything because you don't. So you say, I don't know. Or I need to think about that. Can I think about that? Same thing again here. Ask them to email you the question. Give them the benefit, or let them give you the benefit of some time to think about a coherent answer. The other trick to use is to say, look, I don't know. I haven't thought about that yet. Has anybody here thought about this? Does anybody here have an answer? Because often, if you're in an environment with 50 people there may be a few people who have studied this particular thing, and they can answer the question. The person asking the question doesn't really care who answers it. They just want their question answered. So if you facilitate that, that's a win for you. So these are the photo credits that I used in this presentation. And this is my last slide. All of the free stuff I mentioned, the checklist, the talk, the free chapter about overcoming fear, the video we talk about basic advice and information on presenting without slides. These are the links for all of those things which you can go and grab. I also write a lot. So my blog has over 1,600 blog posts. There's about 150 that are purely about public speaking. So if you like what I had to say, you should go over there and check that stuff out. So I'm going to take a look now at the Q&A. Okay, so here's a question from Virginia. Virginia, are you still with us? I hope you are because I'm answering your question. How do you prepare for an impromptu talk, i.e., given an hour beforehand to prepare a short talk? You know what the topics are, but not the specifics. That's easy for me to answer. That's this last link, how to present without slides. I would sit down. I'd think carefully about who the audience was. I'd think about the topic. What are the 5 or 6 most common questions that people have about this topic? The 5 or 6 most common mistakes people make. And I'd make an outline of those things. And then maybe for each one of those, I'd think of a story or an example or a reference, and I'd build my talk around those. And if I'm an expert on the subject, I could talk about those 5 questions and my answer to them pretty easily without a lot of structure or planning. Okay, do you have good reading tips or similar on preparing? This is David. David, are you still with us? I hope so. Do you have good reading tips or similar on preparing the presentation itself? It's a creative process to struggle with, how to tell the right story, what should keep in the presentation, what should be removed, and so on. So this is hard to answer. It's just as tips. The chapter in the book called Do Not Eat the Microphone is precisely about this. It offers a very specific method for preparing. In short, I recommend that you come up with a brief outline, Focus on the audience again. What things do they want to know? What are the best stories to tell that are the most informing? Make a list of those, and then very quickly practice. Try to speak for 20 minutes or a half hour based on those stories. Just talk. Talk to yourself. Stand up at your desk and talk to the wall and talk through those stories. And as you do that, you'll start to shape them differently. You may have to pause a little bit. You get stuck. Okay. Work your way through, and then revise. Revise that outline, revise that list. And then maybe once you've tried to talk your way through and you've revised it a few times, only then start thinking about slides. You want to start with what you say. Given a choice between only hearing your voice or only seeing your slides, people just want to hear your voice. Your voice has way more information in it than your slides do. So that's my short answer to the preparation question. Okay, Christian, I would like to come back to the split audience problem. Thank you for bringing this up, because a few people asked it, I think, before we started. What do you do if you realize your audience is split between very experienced people and novice people? This is something I would work hard to avoid. If the organizer should be trying to avoid it too. I should be writing my description in a way that specifies if I am truly expecting one or the other. If I'm not truly expecting one or the other, then I shouldn't be surprised that I get a mix of experience levels. So there's sort of your title and your description should reflect to people the bar for coming, or your expectations of them when they come. If you don't want novices, your title should say advanced, super extreme, basket weaving. If you do want novices and you don't want experts, say what to do if you've never weaved a basket before. And that's going to help you just filter it out. It's going to help you split. It's going to help you minimize this problem. If it happens in real time, you end up somewhere in the middle. You end up trying to find stories or anecdotes that cut across. I mean, if you listen to Radio Lab or This American Life or even The Moth, you listen to people who are telling stories with they're telling stories. There are ways to tell stories about a subject that cut across expertise, that they're interesting for novices and they're interesting for experts. It takes more thoughtfulness to figure out what those stories are, but you can do it. And if you focus on those kinds of storytelling and exploring those sorts of lessons, then their expertise in the audience doesn't matter quite as much. Brian asked, I talk fast, like Jesse Eisenberg fast. Is it best to prepare more material so talk doesn't go by too fast, or try to really slow down? Brian, would you want me to talk like this for an hour? Would this be great if I did this for an hour and I kept talking, I didn't stop, I didn't breathe, I didn't do everything? Could you handle this, or would you want to shoot yourself? I think you'd want to shoot yourself. You can learn to slow down. Of all the problems to have, this is one of the better ones, because it's not about your material, it's not about even your tone of voice, it's simply about learning to be patient and learning to breathe. And you can practice this really easily. This is also the same way to practice getting rid of ums. Is you talk for a minute, set a timer, start talking, read the Gettysburg Address, and do it without saying And then practice your material and do it without saying for as long as you can. As soon as you say you start over. And you practice and you practice and you practice. And eventually you'll be saying less and less and less. Is that fun? No. Does it take a while? Yes. But it's an undeniable way to solve that problem. Speaking too fast is the same thing. Your job then is to take the Gettysburg Address and see how long you can do it. Set a timer and try to do it in 5 minutes. Then try to do it in 6 minutes, slowing down. Try to do it in 8 minutes, 10 minutes. Is it fun? No. Will it drive you crazy? Yes. But you can practice that skill and you can do it. Question. Deathbud PowerPoint. Is this an answer to a question or a question? I think he's just plugging some link that he has. Sorry, Rick. I don't know what that question is. Oh, I answered Robert's question by accident. How about that? Look at that. I'm going to scroll back through here to see if I can find other questions that I missed. Question, is this for me? Is it okay to give the slides to friends? If you're assuming about the slides in this presentation, absolutely. Let's see. Would you recommend training like improv theater classes? Yes. I think it can only help you. You learn some basic theatrical things in improv. I actually wrote a post, which maybe I can find somewhere, about improv. The basic thing that helped me the most in taking improv. So I've taken improv a few different times. I took it about 10 years ago, and I started taking it again a year ago. It got me far more comfortable with things going wrong. It got me far more comfortable with Q&A because it taught me little tiny skills and little tiny lessons that allowed me to listen better. A lot of what you actually learn, this is a surprise to most people, is what you learn in improv is how to listen better. I'm going to post my link actually to a thing I wrote about why I recommend taking improv class. You learn to listen better and to pay attention better. And as a speaker, that only helps you in being more sensitive to what the audience is trying to say, doing better at Q&A, responding to things in real time. Improv also puts you in these super fun games, and the games teach you not to be so stressed out about whatever's going on in the moment. It teaches you to trust yourself, which are all good things for anyone speaking or trying to do anything interesting in life. Those are good things to learn. Okay, Rick says, sorry, please comment on the common practice of putting up complicated slides. Yes. I can tell in 5 slides whether someone's going to be a good speaker or not, usually by how much time it seems they put into their slides. There's this very defensive mechanism that people have that they're so nervous about speaking and they're so afraid to practice actually saying their talk that they just spend 10 hours working on their slides, working on them, adding more diagrams, layers, bullet points, and these things become enormously complicated. And they probably never practiced with these complicated slides. And then they get up there in front of an audience, and they feel naked, and they go, oh, right, my slides. And then they just spend an hour describing their slides to the audience. It's just horrible. It's such a tragedy. They lose the purpose of the slides. The slides are supposed to support you. They're supposed to back you up. People are there to hear you and to see you. And if you try to distract them, have a decoy, by making your slides amazingly complicated, it doesn't actually serve the audience as well as you think. So working on your talk by practicing it without slides avoids that problem tremendously. Some people say, well, Scott, I have to hand off my slide deck. It's going to be sent around. This is what Gar Reynolds, who wrote the very good book, Presentation Zen, calls a slidument, a combination of a document and a slide deck. And it's a mistake. You're much better off having a handout that you made and a separate deck that's actually used to present. So it's 10:59. I guess I have time for one more question. I'll probably stay on until they kick me off, actually, but we're almost out of time. So before I forget, thank you all for listening. I hope you check the links out and check the book out. So, David, you're going to cut me off now?
Hi, Scott. No, we're not going to cut you off. Please, okay. If you're giving us the time, we will take it. Hang on, answer audience questions, whatever you'd like to do, but I just want to let folks know we did push out a code to you all. So if you didn't open your group chat, please open it. There's a code in there to save you some money today as a thank you for attending the webcast. O'Reilly has Scott's books on sale for you today. So we invite you to take advantage of that. He's got some great ones. He's got The Year Without Pants, Confessions of a Public Speaker, Making Things Happen, and The Myths of Innovation, all full of great information that can really help you with your day-to-day. So we invite you to take advantage of that code. We'll turn it back to you, Scott.
Thanks for letting me continue. You guys are free to go, guys, if you want, of course. But these are good questions, and I'm having fun. Now I lost my place in the chat room. Hold on one second. Let's see. Presenting to youth, the presenting to youth ones I think I covered. I'd be more interactive. I'd be less formal. I'd tell stories. I tell stories about people their age. If I'm comfortable doing Q&A, I try to focus on their questions and make it from their perspective as much as possible, which is good advice really for any presentation. Instructional designer. Here we go. So Paula, as an instructional designer who's required to prepare material to be delivered by others, can you offer tips the best way to get them to engage with this material? Wow. I spent 2 years, I worked in the training group at Microsoft years and years ago. And so I worked in groups and I managed training. I taught courses and workshops, but I managed the development of other instructional material. This is tricky. I struggled as an instructor with teaching material that other people made. I found that it usually tried to do too much, and there wasn't enough room for me as the person in the classroom to modify and adjust to fit my teaching style. So I think that's something very important for instructional designers to realize, that you're providing props to someone who's a magician. You want to give them room and options and the ability to change things. You want to give them clay. And assuming that you think the instructors are good, you want to give them different kinds of clay. If you think the instructors are bad, then you have a real problem, because now it's sort of like you're trying to control the way a surgeon works by designing the scalpel differently. It's very hard to do. If you want them to engage with the material you are making, the simplest thing is to have them involved in the development of the material. There's no other way. Otherwise, they're always going to think it's something that's being enforced on them. If they're involved in the material, they see an alpha version of the course, and they get to give you feedback on it early on, and they get to see that you're interested and you're going to make adjustments based on what they suggest. Then they have reason to feel invested and feel connected to the material because they helped make it. Politically, that may not be possible, but that'd be my best answer. Marie Blanche, you asked, I'm sorry, David. Thank you for asking again. Any suggestions for preparing to speak on a webcast? Hard to speak without audience feedback. No doubt. Thank you for acknowledging that. So, you're asking a good question because you're giving me pause. I think that practicing the way I'm suggesting, where you are sitting alone or standing alone in your office talking to an imagined audience, is a natural way to prepare, because that's what it feels like. A webcast feels like you're talking to an imagined audience. So the more you practice where you're speaking in your full voice to your couch, pretending there's people there, the more in your own crazy psychology the transition gets a little bit easier. Second, what these guys have done, O'Reilly, they run these things well. They set up the chat room for me. I had the option to do polls. I actually had a few. I just forgot about them. Doing things to engage you and to see what's going on helps, and you should build that into your talk. I had planned to, but I could have done a better version of that with you guys. I did jump into the chat room a couple of times. I probably could have had a couple of minutes where I just focused on Q&A in the middle of the talk. So anything you can do like that will help. You have to be good at switching windows and whatnot, but it's entirely doable. I think the same general advice is true again. A webcast should probably be shorter, especially if you're uncomfortable with the format. And then you can depend on Q&A. If you don't get many questions, then you know that your webcast was probably the right length, or it could have been shorter. If you go for an hour, you've never done one before, that's putting a lot of pressure on you to imagine how it's going to go. And I think, let's see, I had 2 questions left here. Rick Evans mentioned a couple of methods on public speaking, Pechakucha and the Lessig method. Another good one is Ignite. I actually help organize the Seattle Ignite. Ignite is like Pechakucha, except it's 5 minutes long, so the format's a little bit simpler, but it's the same basic idea. So let's see. Do I prepare multiple versions of a presentation or tailor the talk to the audience on the fly? Hi, Lauren. How are you? I usually have a simple version of the talk, and when I Well, it depends. This talk today, I've never done before. I put this together. I practiced it a few times. Entirely new, developed just for this audience. If I were to do this talk again for a live audience, I would probably walk through it thinking about how my new audience is different, and then make some modifications, and that'd be it. For other talks I do, though, so I'm an author, so I do a lot of talks about my books. I have a generic version of a talk about each of the books. And I've done some of those talks so many times that often I'm invited in to talk, just a general talk about the myths of innovation. I'll use that slide deck. And I will note in my mind the things I will do differently depending on the audience. Instead of telling a story about the aeronautics industry, if I'm speaking to a plumbing convention, I'll do some research and find a plumbing story. And I'll just swap that into the talk. So this core structure of the talk will probably stay the same, but some of the anecdotes and some of the references I use will change because of the audience that I have. Question from Tracy. The others address speaking when there's no time set up in an interview presentation or on someone else's tech. Your viewpoint. I'm not sure I understand the question. When there's no time to set up in an interview presentation. Oh, I see. Well, speaking on someone else's tech is almost always avoidable, as I mentioned before. Almost any conference room with the same hookup, as long as you bring your dongle or your doohickey or whatever the thing is. So you can just insist that you want to present off your deck. So I'm not really sure I understand that question. So this is the last call for questions. I'm going to take one quick look to see if there are any that I missed. Let's see here. Going once, going twice. I see a question about Pechacucha. Let's see. Larry's got one. This is a good question. Larry's got a good question. Thank you, Larry. How much do you move around when you are presenting? Importance of body language. Body language is not that important. It's important that you, as a speaker, care about what you're talking about. It's important that you are energetic about it. Those two things are important. The specifics of the shape of your hand, the specifics of whether you stand behind the lectern or next to it, the specifics of those things does not matter that much. If I saw you speak, because I do speaker coaching, if I saw you speak, I could probably critique you on those things and give you little tips or little things that are mistakes, but those are never fundamental mistakes. Never. That's never the reason why people go, that guy sucked. People go, that guy sucked because your stories weren't well thought out. You didn't address the key things people wanted to hear. So I don't think it matters that much. It does matter if you do things that are distracting. If you're a pacer and you're pacing nervously, that's distracting. Just like when you go to the zoo and you see the tiger pacing back and forth, that kind of means the tiger is really uncomfortable once they kill something. So you're pacing back and forth. That has an impact on the energy the audience is going to get from you. I think you should do what feels comfortable. I think improv is definitely a way to figure out what makes you comfortable, because taking an improv class will force you to try different things. But I don't think body language matters that much. I think what's much more important, actually, is volume. You're in a theater environment. The volume of your voice, even with a microphone, changes your posture. If you're trying to be loud, you'll tend to stand up straight. You'll tend to make direct eye contact if you're trying to be loud. Just the first tip I give people who have body language issues, or who get a little bit physically shy when they're up there, I say, be loud. You are the center of attention. Just own it. It's awkward, yes, just own it, and you'll feel more comfortable in a few minutes, and people will respond better to you. Let's see. What kind of presentation style should I use to present to executives? For example, asking for more budget for a product. The presentation is virtual. I don't see their facial expressions. Well, Mary, the best advice is every organization has different cultures, and different cultures have different values. So there's no universal answer. The only answer I could give you, if I were in that situation, I would do everything I could to sit in on one of these presentations someone else was doing. and then ask the people who are the other participants for their feedback on how it was done. Or in other words, I'd want to see someone doing a good job in this format in my company. So I have some idea about what things to do more of and what things to do less of. And it's very hard to give an abstract answer. I've presented in banks. Banks are very conservative environments. They like charts. They want numbers. They want to see someone in a nice, a suit and tie, giving very clear, logical things. I've also spoken at, art museums where people are, they want to hear something more. They want to hear different stories. They want to hear empathetic stories. There's no universal answer. It's very cultural dependent. But if one observes someone else doing it, and at least make my own notes on things they did well and things that they didn't. Okay, folks, I'm going to sign off. Thank you for listening and asking the questions. I will write up a list of all the questions and my answers and post them on the blog, probably later today, or later today or tomorrow morning. So if there's a question and you realize you want to get back and see the answers, that stuff will make it online in the next 24 hours or so. So I hope you enjoyed the book, and good luck in your future presentations, guys. See ya.
Thank you again, Scott, for taking the time to answer all the questions that did come in. The audience really appreciates it. Folks that stuck around, we thank you so much and really appreciate you staying with us, joining us today, and, of course, for sending in your questions, because having your questions really adds so much more to our events. We did record today's live event, and we will have the recording ready within 48 hours, and lots of you are asking if you can share it with friends and colleagues, and yes, absolutely. Scott has such great information that can really help us all, so we appreciate you spreading the good word. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude our webcast today. Goodbye, everybody.